I did a practice gouache painting of my succulent plant the other day and I posted it showing my first layer of paint versus several layers later. And I had some comments and DMs about how people didn't realize that you can layer gouache and asking about how I layer it and my technique overall. And I've never used gouache without layering it, so it's the only way I really know how to use this paint. So I'm going to show you how I take my very basic and messy, simple first layer to a finished piece with depth and lighting a few layers later. I'm going to be using this reference photo from Pexels, which I'll link below, so hopefully you can try this out yourself and paint along with me. And I always start with a very basic sketch, nothing too detailed because I cover this pretty quickly, but it gives me a guide of where to put my first layer. And I do simplify this a bit, so I don't put that kind of red railing that you see in the corner there, and some of that background detail I simplify even more. Now, before we go into the painting, I'm going to show you very quickly the varying levels of thickness of paint that I use. So the paint straight out of the tube or out of the palette, as I'm using the Himi gouache palette, is a very thick paste-like consistency. I hardly ever use it like this, and if I do, it's for the very final details and highlights, but even then I dilute it a bit with water because it's very thick. First layer of my paintings is always the most watered down. It's watercolor-like consistency without being super translucent, so you can still see the color well, but it's very watery and it dries really quickly too. Then by incrementally adding a bit more paint, you get this kind of melted butter consistency, which means it has a bit more body to it, but it's still thin-ish. And you can keep adding to this to make it slightly thicker and thicker. And so as I build the layers on top of each other, they do get a bit thicker. And lastly, I want to show you that how mixing even just a tiny bit of white, like we're talking a very dot amount, helps the color become more opaque and have that more creamier consistency and look. Okay, so starting that first layer with the most watered down consistency paint, I'm going to be looking at my reference photo and picking out the colors I see, laying down the most simplified version of these colors. So no gradients or mixes, just flat washes of the colors. And I do this so that it gives me a general idea of where everything is placed. This is why I don't really do an intricate sketch, because once this layer is down, you can't really see the sketch at all, but that this first wash of color acts like that initial guide. With this layer, I would say don't worry too much about getting the perfect colors. You're going to be building on top of this, so just try to get the general gist of the color you see. For example, the sky is a lightish blue, so I lay down that flat wash of light blue, and then the background is kind of like varying tones of gray. And then for the plant, I'm just using two colors, one really dark blue, indicating where all the shadows are, and then a really light green where the sun is hitting the plant. So you can see that my first layer is looking really flat, a bit wonky and messy. It's really important not to get discouraged at this stage. This is your foundation layer and you'll start building upon this. So before I go on to my second layer, I make sure to clean my water, change it out for clean water so I don't get contamination and my colors don't muddy. And then I build my second layer with slightly thicker paint. And by slightly thicker paint, I mean that melted butter consistency, which has a bit more body, is not as runny, and so it's a bit more pigmented too. And I'm intensifying those background colors, making them lighter where I need, like the wall in the sunlight, or darker like the floor and back wall. And you can see how the second layer of paint on the background is making it look more opaque. You should be seeing that there's not as much translucent marks on the page, so you can't see the paper through the paint as much. I do come back to the background a bit later, but only to do a few minor touch-ups. You want to leave the background in a good enough place that you don't have to go back to it and do anything too major once you've started on the foreground details. And before we continue, just a quick studio break for a word from today's sponsor, Surfshark. I really like working in cafes, and I've actually been trying to paint more in public, and I like to take my laptop or phone to do my admin stuff while I'm out and about. And by using Surfshark, which is a virtual private network, I can keep my information safe while I'm using public Wi-Fi. When your device connects to the internet, all your information is in a way blurred out, so you can stay safe while connected. I've also been loving accessing films that aren't streaming in the country I'm in. For example, I really wanted to watch Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind again because I hadn't watched it in ages, and I was able to Google which country it was streaming on and change my VPN location to that country so I could watch it. You can get Surfshark VPN at the link in my description box below and enter my promo code so you can get 3 months for free so you can try it out. Okay, so let's get back to our painting. So starting with the plant, I go in and redefine the oranges a bit with some lighter gouache, and I begin really intensifying the shadows of the plant and add more leaves, going from darker leaves to the lighter leaves that are in the sun. So with these darker leaves, I don't use a pure black for the shadows. I like to have the shadows be more blue toned, and I think this is a stylistic choice because I feel like it goes in more harmony with the whole painting in general. Then I start adding the shadows to the oranges, and this starts to give everything a bit more definition and shape. And this is because we're adding those high contrast areas of light versus shadow. I'm concentrating on really creating those shapes so my brushstrokes are steadier because I'm wanting to create that definition. And this is going to help overall with really creating dimension as well in this piece and go from that flat first layer to a really built out 3D kind of popping gouache piece. Then I begin to build out the leaves that are not in the full shadow. And this starts or continues my process in building out this plant, going from the lighter areas to the darker and kind of playing around, bouncing around between darkening certain leaves and lightening certain leaves as well. And I'm just using my reference to guide me with this. And here I'm going back to the background and just smoothing out some areas with a bit more paint. And I realized I needed to darken some areas too. And that tends to happen once you're putting down the colors. You can see how they work together. So it's a bit of a game of adjusting the colors as you go. But that's really normal when painting, so don't expect to mix the perfect colors from the start. With the plant pot, I started with a mid-tone, and now I'm putting the darker color on top and allowing the mid-tone to poke through where the sun is hitting the pot. And this is something I tend to do when I'm painting shadow. I'll start with the base layer of the color I want to be poking through and then lay the dark shadow on top. Then I go in with really defining those highlights, and I'll do this a few times throughout because as the paint dries, it color shifts, so I'll keep re-adding brighter highlights throughout. You can see here I'm doing some blending on the page. With my brush, I'm mixing the paint from the brush and the paint that's already on the paper to create that gradient effect that the light is making on the pot. Then I begin with my favorite part, which is adding those highlights all over the plant, and this is going to make everything start to pop because we're upping that light and shadow contrast. And here I'm going in with those final bright details on the leaves, and you can really see how all this layering is coming together now. And not every single leaf needs detail. You can create the illusion of detail overall by just picking a few. Here I'm just using my wet brush and a tiny bit of paint to sharpen some of those lines in the background, and because the paint reactivates with water, you don't need thick paint for this. A little bit of light paint and water will help reactivate and kind of move the paint where you need to move it. Okay, and these are the final bright highlights, I promise, and then after this we're done. And here's the final piece, a nice bright sunny orange plant. Let me know if you followed along. I'd love to see what you created, and let me know if you have questions too. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye!